What if I told you that Russian is actually easier to learn than you think? And it's not just because my course Conversations Unlocked makes the language easy. Да не, в этом видео просто хочется делиться 9 причинами, почему я считаю, что русский язык на самом деле не такой сложный язык, как многим кажется. I recommend you watch till the end of the video because knowing these reasons will help you get motivated and stay consistent to learn Russian whenever you hit a rough patch. So here are the 9 things I've learned throughout my 8 years of learning Russian. Imagine saying in English, I hungry. That's wrong. You need to say, I am hungry. But in Russian, you can just say, я голодный. These 2 words separate mean I hungry. But if you put them together, now they mean I am hungry. You see, in Russian, you can just skip the is, am, are forms of the verb to be. There is a form есть, but you usually only use this when you really want to emphasize that something is something. In 98% of sentences, you can forget about this. Point at a tree and say, это дерево. Literally, it tree, but the word is implied here. And this is very freeing because it's just one less word to think about while you speak. And the less words you need to juggle in your mind while having a conversation, the more mental capacity you've got left to focus on what you actually want to say. Вы когда-нибудь задумывались о том, насколько ужасен английский язык? You've got American, British, and Australian English, and go a little bit deeper and compare, for example, Scottish English with Southern USA English. Those are 2 completely different languages. Even if you're a native speaker, there are some English accents you barely understand without exposure. And Russian is so much better in this aspect. While there are some dialects, most of the population can and will speak standardized Russian. And if they do have a bit of a dialect, I've often found it to be close to standard Russian anyways. So these differences are small compared to the dialects in other languages. For example, here in the Netherlands, if you move 200 kilometers, people can speak a completely different language almost. But in Russia, if you move from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, people will speak pretty much the same, and you can thank Soviet imperialism for that. Most Russian speakers you'll meet will speak standard Russian, and 98% of movies, series, music, etc. also use this form. So all you have to do is learn to understand and speak one single accent, and this simplifies the language learning process so much because if you understand this one accent, you understand everyone else too. Coolest thing I find this is in Russian. Whoa, that's a weird word order. I meant, of course, I find this the coolest thing in Russian. You can pretty much put any word at any place and the sentence will be grammatically correct in Russian. But in English, you can't say speak I Russian or speak Russian I. Maybe if you're Shakespeare, you can say Russian I speak. But in Russian, you can say я говорю по-русски. Говорю по-русски я. Я по-русски говорю. Говорю я по-русски, etc. So Russian has a flexible word order, and this is great news for you and me. Why? Well, you can just start a sentence with the first word that comes to mind and then continue speaking. So you don't need to completely form the sentence before speaking like you would in strict word order languages like English, for example. And this makes you sound much more fluent faster as your sentences will simply flow better. Представьте, что вы изучаете голландский язык, a small country with 30 million speakers worldwide. What does that mean for you? Well, that there's barely any good material available to learn it. There are maybe 10 Dutch movies you can find with English subtitles online. This is not the case for Russian, because there are more than 300 million Russian speakers worldwide. There's a ton of content out there to learn the language. Whatever your preferred type of learning, there is a Russian course that uses that method. And even for me now, even after 8 years of learning, there's still so many Russian movies, series, books that I want to enjoy that I'm sure I'll never run out of interesting content. Have you ever thought how to say the past in English? Maybe you were thinking about it, but then decided you had thought enough of it. The English past is horrible. There's lots of tenses and lots of irregular verbs. Russian is much better. Take the infinitive пропагандировать, to make or spread propaganda. Now, to make the past, you remove the last t and add l. If it's a man, он пропагандировал. If it's a woman, она пропагандировала. And if it's plural, они пропагандировали. And it works like that for all verbs. There's maybe a handful of common exceptions, but you'll learn these quickly once you're at the point where you're actually learning the past tense. It's simply so refreshing to not have to mess around with conjugations in the Russian past tense, and it makes a big difference when speaking. Now, there's one complication in the past tense, which are the perfective, imperfective verbs, but that's for another video, and frankly, you only really need to worry about that at the upper beginner intermediate stage. But the simplicity of Russian past tense conjugation makes it much easier to sound fluent in Russian, as you cannot make many mistakes here. Вы знали, что в США есть около 3 миллионов человек, говорящих по-русски? That's about 1% of the entire population. And in Germany, it's also around 3 million, and that's almost 4%. And since about 2 years ago, these numbers have only increased. I hear Russian now every day on the streets in Amsterdam, when I take a walk, when I go shopping, when I go for a workout even. And this is great because it gives me plenty of opportunity to practice my Russian skills. Now, I live in a European capital with a good quality of life, so naturally it attracts lots of expats, and not to speak about tourists. But the point is that Russian speakers are everywhere on the planet. Maybe not as much as, for example, Spanish speakers if you're in the US, but Russian speakers are a close second or third. That means you might already know some native speakers, and if you don't, chances are you can find them if you're willing to look for them. And this is great because it gives you the opportunity for offline practice and real connection, which will both be super helpful for becoming fluent in Russian. What does the cat have in common with a dog? In English, you often use the or a in front of these words. English is actually alright in this aspect, but take le, la, une in French, de, het, een in Dutch, or der, das, die in German, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Even in the Netherlands, if someone speaks great Dutch, I can still often hear they're not native because they make mistakes with the articles. What does this have to do with Russian? Well, Russian is pragmatic. There are no articles. So just one last thing to think about. And this is so refreshing because in my opinion, these words don't add a lot to our speech anyways. Maybe they make it a bit more obvious if you're talking about a random dog on the street or the specific dog from your aunt. But for Russian speakers learning English, this is horrible. I petted a cat on street today instead of I petted a cat on the street today. But for us learning Russian, we're lucky. No articles, and that's a reason to celebrate. You don't need to think of these little pesky words that have small impact on the meaning of our speech, and you can actually focus on what you want to say. In the Netherlands, when Russian speakers hear me speak Russian, they often say something like «Вы так хорошо говорите по-русски, я бы хотел говорить по-голландски так, как вы говорите по-русски». And my reply is usually something like «Спасибо, но это мы, голландцы, виноваты в этом. Это не ваша вина». That's because Dutch people speak English well, so we often do not give foreigners the opportunity to speak Dutch. But in Russia, or many other countries where Russian is one of the spoken languages, the level of English is usually pretty low, meaning that if you're there, you have to speak Russian. Necessity is the mother of invention, and after you sit at the dinner table with Russians for an hour without saying a word because you cannot join the conversation, you'll be motivated to change that. Believe me. In English, there's a poem called The Chaos. Dearest creature in creation, studying English pronunciation, I will teach you in my verse. Sounds like corpse, corpse, horse, and worse. This poem just shows how messed up English pronunciation is. One letter can have so many different sounds, and most of them are unpredictable. Russian is so much better here. Most letters have one correct pronunciation. Then there are a couple of vowels that maybe have two, depending on the stress, and there are a couple of small exceptions that are pretty logical. So Russian pronunciation is kind of straightforward. Not worrying too much about pronunciation allows you to focus your mental resources on actually having conversations. A downside here is that you do need to learn the stresses, but that's something that with time and exposure to spoken Russian happens on its own. Хотите также говорить по-русски, как я? One of the fastest ways to learn to have conversations in Russian is by joining my course, Conversations Unlocked. This course will help you think in Russian, and people are loving the course. Click the link in the description, start going through the lessons, and you'll be surprised by how quickly you'll pick up Russian.